My name is Rush Hill, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the February already, a meeting of Wake Up Newport. And I want you to know that in my initial remarks, I got both the month and the organization correct. Yes. Wonderful world through meds. We have an exciting meeting for you this morning. I hope you brought your hip boots because you're going to walk out of here a little sloshy, I think. But it's going to be a great educational morning. So as the custom, whether you like it or not, I have to introduce Mr. Rosansky, who heads our great organization, absolutely wonderful individual. So.
Thank you, Russ. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the, February edition of Wake Up Newport. Maybe I need to adjust my meds. Great crowd here. Who would have ever thought that sea level rise would have so much interest? Just kidding. Obviously, very important topic, and we'll get to that in just a minute. We'll introduce our speaker. But we do have a few dignitaries with us this morning. I'll just point out our mayor's here, Will O'Neill, back there. Jeff Herdman and Joy Brenner, City Council people. Jeff's got a newsletter he sends out. I said, Jeff, can you put this in your newsletter so that I get a few people showing up for this thing? And apparently it works. I'm going to get him to advertise this event every month. We have a couple of my former colleagues on City Council, Keith Curry and Nancy Gardner here this morning. Also, both former mayors. We're all going to be tonight honored at the mayor's reception, or mayor's dinner. We do the mayor's reception at Speak Up Newport tonight. So, but glad to see we're going to bookend the day with those two. We have a couple of our harbor commissioners here this morning, Paul Blank and Don Yan. Thank you for coming. Our Director of Community Development, Simone Jurgis, is here this morning. Simone. And our Utilities Director, Mark Vukovic, is here this morning as well. I hope I got everybody, such a big crowd, I might have missed somebody. So thank you all for coming. We don't have a restaurant sponsor this morning, but we do have someone in the audience that's thinking about sponsoring our program, so make sure you whoop it up a little bit, have some good questions. We want to impress them this morning. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to turn it back over to Rush. He's going to introduce our speaker, and I'll have a few closing comments at the very end. Thanks.
Well, today we have a very interesting, a very important, and a very, no pun intended, high water topic. Dr. Brett Sanders is with UCI. He is a professor of civil and environmental engineering, urban planning, public policy at all of those activities at UCI. He also serves as the head of the Flooding and Poverty Division of the UCI Blum Center for Poverty and, yes, something I didn't even know existed. Not the poverty, I understand that totally, yes. I'm married, yes. Dr. Sanders earned his BS in civil engineering from UC Berkeley and then went on to the University of Michigan, where he earned a PhD in civil engineering, and he's been on the faculty at UCI since 1997. Dr. Sanders' research focuses on the growing challenges of flooding and erosion. He is an expert on computer algorithms for flood and erosion simulation, and recent research has been directed to using computer visualization of flooding to improve flood awareness and enhance support of decision-making needs. He also studies in the intersection between sediment and flood risk, particularly under the accelerated sea level rise where coastlines face a sediment deficit that risk increased flooding damage. Sounds like he has, in his resume, just described Newport Beach from one end to the other. Please give a warm chamber welcome to Dr. Brett Sanders.
Well, thank you all for having me today. I didn't know this was such a fun group. Wow. You guys have way too much fun, and it's like 7 in the morning. Yeah, so thank you so much for the invitation to be here today, and I'm really delighted to share some of the research that we've been doing at UCI and some of my own perspectives on sort of outlook for the future and ways we can manage it. I guess kind of starting off here, I have a slide of our coastline view from Google Earth, kind of imagining you're out in the ocean and you're up in a helicopter and looking back on the coastline, and what you see is this enormous ocean. You see the Southern California metropolitan region, which is like the 3rd largest economy in the world, measured by GDP, enormous powerhouse, enormous activity, 15 million people. And so these things are coming together. And so this is putting enormous stress on our coastline. And we're hearing about some serious concerns. We're hearing sea level rise is going to threaten thousands of California homes. But there's another sort of dimension to this which has sort of captured my attention, that we need our coastline, we need sediment, we need sand to defend against these rising seas. And there's concern that we're going to run out. So if you look globally at supplies of sand, they're being used really quickly. Anybody know why? Concrete. So to build the major cities of the world, which are growing like crazy, this sand is being used for concrete. So, I think another interesting perspective, and an interesting statistic to share, is that the world's population has doubled since about 1960. So we had around 3 billion people around 1960. Now we're looking at 7 billion people, and the expectation is that another 40 or so years, we're going to have another 3 billion people. Okay, so we're growing like crazy. There's this enormous human influence over the world, and this influence is coming to the coastline. Around the world, people are moving from rural areas into coastal areas, into cities, and increasingly cities along coastlines. So what this means is that globally, we have to think about increasing numbers of cities along the coastline trying to grow at a time when sea levels are rising. And this puts enormous pressure on the world to manage that. So we might ask, how do we defend against that? And nature has a system to deal with coastal flooding, and we love them here in Southern California. They're an incredible resource. They are, in many ways, the cultural identity of Southern California, which is our beaches. And they are a natural defense against coastal flooding. And they're smart. You might not realize how smart a beach is. Let me talk you through why a beach is so smart. In the summertime, we have a condition where waves are relatively light. We sometimes get those big southern swells. Big storms off of Antarctica create enormous waves, and we see those summer swells that hit our south-facing beaches. And we do get erosion in the summertime. In fact, in 1960, we nearly lost the southern part of Newport Peninsula to a big swell event. But overall, the primary pattern of waves in Southern California is lighter waves in the summer and bigger, more energetic waves in the winter. And so when we have lighter waves, what happens is that those lighter waves push sediment onto the beach, and we make the beach bigger and wider, okay? So that you create a big, wide beach, which has this storage, it has this potential to provide defense against storms, defense against erosion, okay? The sand is your defense. And then what happens in the winter? Well, the big waves come, and it starts pulling that sand off the beach. And as that sand gets pulled off the beach, it forms a sandbar offshore. And what the sandbar does is really smart. The sandbar creates shallow water that forces the waves to break further offshore. So then the energy striking the coastline is reduced. So should we give it up for beaches? Okay, so these beaches are fabulous. They're smart. They have a built-in system to deal with coastal flooding to protect coastlines against erosion, okay? And so what we want to be thinking of as scientists and researchers now is how do we work more with these natural processes, enhance those natural processes so we let nature do more of the work to defend against coastal flooding and erosion as we move forward. Okay, so what I want to do today is just give you an outline on 3 points, okay? Number 1 point is, are we losing beaches in Southern California, and if so, where? Okay. Second point is, what's causing our beaches to change size? And the third point, which I'm going to take a little liberty here, and as a professor, just throw some ideas out there that maybe stick, that might not stick, but just maybe generate some conversations, which, how might you manage the impacts of sea level rise in Newport Beach with sediment, okay? And these are not 90% designs. These are conceptual ideas that I think are worthy of discussion. So let's start with beaches. I had a fun time this past summer. There's some high school students here, right? We have some high school students here? All right, welcome. Last summer I had some students from University High School get involved in helping me to monitor changing beaches in Orange County. Do high school students care about beaches? Yes. Absolutely. Without Instagram and everything else, you got to have your good pictures. You have a lot of fun at beaches. Everyone has a good time at beaches. We all care about beaches. So what we did with the students is we went on Google Earth and Google Earth Pro software, which anyone can download. You can go in, there's a tool, and you can pull in an aerial imagery and measure the width of the beach. Not only that, but you can go through historical aerial imagery and measure how wide the beach was over different periods of time. So you can go back in time, see how the beaches are changing across Orange County. So Jenna Kim and Gwen Sanders, who happens to be my daughter, did this past summer, and they learned all about how beaches are changing. And then they went and they're starting a club at University High School to get more high school students involved in monitoring the beaches, seeing how the beaches are changing, increasing awareness of our beaches. So we have more people informed and educated about our beaches. So what did they learn? They collected beaches from all across Orange County, from basically up near Seal Beach down to Dana Point and Doheny beaches. And they collected data on how the beaches were changing over time, and then they fit a simple linear trend to each of those signals, okay? The trend is noisy, okay? It's noisy because tides go up and down, and when the tide is high, the beach looks small. When the tide is low, the beach looks big. We also have seasonal trends. So in the summer, we know the beaches is wider, and then in the winter, the beach gets smaller. But if you look at all that noise, sometimes you still see a pattern, okay? And so we'll see the patterns that they detected. And they came up with their own classification system, which was green meant that the trend looked positive, and it may be an insignificant trend, but it was still positive according to their analysis. Yellow meant that the trend looked a little bit negative, but the confidence, the R-squared statistic, was too low to say anything, okay? And then the red ones were the beaches that were really going down fast, and those ones had significant negative trends in their size. So if you look at the classifications they came up with for Orange County, we see that there's 3 sort of red beaches across Orange County. That's Sunset Beach, and then down at Doheny Beach and Capistrano Beach. So what do they see in the data? You see, if you go back from 1990 to 2020, you can see all these beach measurements, and I said they're noisy, it's noisy data, but you do see a sort of a declining trend in the size of the beach over time. And if you went down to South Doheny Beach, you can see another decline in the size of that beach, and that's a pretty strong decline at close to 3 meters per year of beach loss. Capistrano Beach was closer to around 1 meter per year of beach loss. So in the central Orange County coastline, the data didn't show strong trends one way or the other, okay? So if you look at the data for Newport, West Newport, South Newport, and CDM, you can see it's pretty noisy data. They fit a linear trend to it, but it's a really weak trend. It's not a strong R-squared statistic, okay? These are all like small. So the point is that these are noisy signals. We don't see obvious trend. You might say that there's a trend at CDM towards decreasing beach sand. So why are these changes happening? Well, first let's go down. What happens when you lose your sand? What does the beach look like? This is South Doheny Beach. And what you see here is they've got a cobble base underneath the sand. So once the sand's gone, it exposes this cobble. So you've got a different type of material on the beach. Not every beach is different. Some have cobble bases, some have bedrock base. You'll see different types of profiles at different places. You also start seeing your coastlines being eroded. And so this is state parks. They're losing their parking lot. They have impacts. They're trying to figure out how to manage these challenges. And one of the things you do is you start thinking about protecting infrastructure. And so then come in and you put riprap in, is usually as an emergency measure to try to guard your infrastructure. Typically, this will just accelerate the beach erosion. So what will happen is you'll get more reflection of wave energy off of these structures than you would off of a soft beach. And because of that, it digs down even faster and you lose your sand even faster. So these tend to be like stopgap measures, not long-term solutions. And they tend to degrade the quality of the beach over time. And they often have downstream impacts because you may affect the delivery of sediment further downstream. So in order to kind of more broadly increase awareness about beaches, we're also working with the Crystal Cove Conservancy and California State Parks in developing a high school program. So is Sarah Ludovice here? Oh, Sarah's here in the back. If you want to learn more about this program, they bring high school students now from all over Orange County to Crystal Cove. And they go out and they take measurements of the beaches and they study how the beaches are changing and why they're changing and so on and so forth. So this is an opportunity for high school students to learn more about why beaches are changing, how they're changing, how you can collect data about it and learn about it. And of course, I also started a new graduate course at UCI where I'm teaching students about how you can interpret wave data and sediment flux data to try to study how beaches are changing over time. So there's a magazine about this sitting in the back, so if you want to grab that on your way out, you can learn more about that program. So moving on. What's causing beaches to change size? So we already talked about the seasonal change, that when the waves are strong, it pulls sand away. When the waves are weak, it pushes sand onshore. So that's one significant driver of change at a beach, and that's a seasonal change. The bigger change that drives beach size is the delivery of sediment, okay? So there are what are called littoral cells along the Southern California coastline that are currents of sand, okay? We are part of the San Pedro cell here at Newport Beach, which starts around Long Beach and works its way south and actually goes offshore at Newport Beach into Newport Canyon. We're at the end of the littoral cell, which actually has advantages. What it means is that if the supplies from Newport Beach are reduced, it really doesn't have a downstream beach that gets impacted the way, say, if you were to reduce sediment supplies from Huntington Beach or Long Beach, then everybody down coast suffers because your sediment supplies have been reduced. Okay? But at Newport Beach, there's some advantages to being at the end in that changes in your system have less of an impact on downstream. Okay, so what we think about then in terms of these cells is what's the supply of sand into the cell, okay, and where is it going? And when supplies are larger than losses, then you see beaches growing. And when supplies are reduced, then you see beaches getting smaller. Okay. Stormwater infrastructure that we've constructed in Southern California over the last 70, 80 years has had a tremendous impact on the supply of sediment from rivers. Naturally in Southern California, we have these really highly erosive mountains, San Gabriel Mountains, San Bernardino Mountains, and those would naturally have flood flows that come out and work their way to the coastline, okay? And so we would have rivers that can take on different courses on the way to the sea, and near the base of the mountains are areas where water would percolate into the ground and recharge our groundwater, and then big flood flows would make it all the way to the coastline and deliver large volumes of sediment to the coast. That's how the system would naturally work. But you can't develop a region, have a growing economy in a space where you've got rivers that are moving all over the place. Okay, so what was done to manage that risk was to build a set of infrastructure systems that captures sediment at the base of those mountains, that's these basins, and then these channels which then deliver stormwater to the coast. So these stormwater systems were designed at a time when Southern California had a reliable source of water. It was being imported. And so there wasn't as much of a value placed on water conservation. There wasn't as much of a value placed on delivery of sediment to the coastline. And so we have a system that captures sediment at the mountains and then delivers stormwater through channels to the coastline. And what this has done is altered the delivery of sediment to the coastline. So in the context of beaches. In the Los Angeles River and the San Gabriel River, those systems have seen a precipitous decline in the delivery of sediment to the coastline. In the case of the Santa Ana River, there's actually been a smaller decline and a more stable delivery of sediment. And a lot of that has to do with whether the channel is soft bottom or a concrete lined channel. So the channel itself in Southern California has become a source of sediment to the coastline. So whereas historically you would sort of erode the mountains and the sediment would be delivered from the mountains, now we're seeing channels themselves have been eroded. And that was the reason that in San Diego Creek, for example, in Upper Newport Bay, we saw tremendous loads of sediment come into Upper Newport Bay after the stormwater system was created, because those channels themselves were eroding and delivering sediment to Newport Beach, Newport Bay. So anyways, the message number one relative to delivery of sediment is that the infrastructure we've built has changed the delivery of sediment to the coastline. Okay, so we step back a little bit and look at the Southern California system. I think it's fascinating to think about the Los Angeles River historically at one time it drained to Ballona Creek, to Santa Monica Bay. Now we know it drains more towards Long Beach, but you can imagine Southern California in the past with the rivers taking different paths to the coastline and delivering sediment. It's more naturally how it performed. Likewise, the Santa Ana River at times has emptied into up near Long Beach. There's some evidence to suggest that sometime it came into Newport Bay. We know it came into Newport Bay over in West Newport in the past. And so this is how you want to think about the system being more natural in terms of its delivery of sediment to the coastline, delivery of water. So now we can think about delivery of sediment to the coastline and how beaches are changing. Maybe come back to some of those trends that we saw in terms of beach loss. So the first thing we can think about is trends in the flow of water in the Santa Ana River. This is a record from 1930 to 2020 of peak flows in the Santa Ana River. The largest flow on record was back in 1938 when we had a really big flood that caused a lot of damage. And you can see, starting around 1970s, that the pattern of the peak flows changed. You saw much higher levels of more frequent events in this sort of 10,000 to 20,000 cubic feet per second range. But there's been a fairly consistent delivery of storms to the coastline along the Santa Ana River. And when we think about delivery of sediment, sediment comes with the biggest floods. Okay? We don't get sediment coming in small floods. It's those big floods that are delivering like 99% of the sediment. So the big floods are what's going to bring the sediment to the coastline. Okay, so the other thing that's now bringing sediment to our coastline are sand replenishment projects or beach nourishment projects. So to compensate for the loss of sediment from the watersheds, we invest resources in delivering sand onto beaches, either from harbor dredging projects or pumping projects. And what I'm going to show you here are plots of all of the beach nourishment projects that have happened along the Orange County coastline in the history of the coast. So we have data from 1940 or so, like late 30s, through 2020. And we'll see a pattern of adding sediment to the coast through sand replenishment projects. So Long Beach has had a series of projects. Seal Beach has had a series of projects. And most of these initial spikes of sediment were from dredging out harbors and taking the harbor dredging and then putting it on the coastline to grow beaches. The Surfside Sunset project is an Army Corps project that was started in the late 1980s, which was a system to deliver sediment all the way from here all the way down to Newport and nourish this. And this is a lot of sediment. These are big. This is a log scale here. So we have 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, 10 million. So when you look at these plots and you see the numbers going up, that's going up a lot, okay? These are log scales. So we've had really big beach nourishment projects along the coastline. Bolsa Chica went through a restoration process in the 2000s, and you can see the sediment that was brought out from Bolsa Chica. Huntington Beach has had many, many beach nourishment projects over the years, delivering sediment to the coastline. And Newport Beach has had its history of beach nourishment projects. See this big spike here, what's that? That's dredging the harbor, 1938. Yep. So you can see that in the process of dredging out these harbors, we have brought tremendous sediment into the beaches. And now if we go back and look at Sunset Beach and ask, well, gosh, why is Sunset Beach declining in its size? If you go back to this Surfside Sunset project, the last time it was nourished was around 2009. You can see that since 2009, which is around here, there's kind of just been that decline. So this is called a feeder beach. Sunset is designed to be a beach where you add a lot of sediment, every once in a while with a project, and then over time the waves push it down coast. That beach gets smaller while it sustains the other beaches. And the idea behind this project was to episodically put a lot of sediment at sunset, let it work its way south, and serve all the needs of all of the Orange County beaches. Okay, so turning to South County, we saw some more concerning trends. We can think about delivery from the rivers, and the major river there is San Juan Creek. And San Juan Creek has had, you can see the history of peak flows there. More recently, since 2010, there really hasn't been a decent-sized storm coming into the coastal ocean there. So one thing to plant a seed is that it hasn't had big storms in the last decade or so delivering sediment to the coastline. And also, if you look at the history of sediment delivery from, you can see the construction of Dana Point Harbor in the 60s. Capistrano had a couple of smaller projects. San Clemente had a couple of smaller projects. San Onofre had some projects. When they built the power station at San Onofre, the whole mesa was chopped off to create room for the power plant, and that material was put down on the beach. So the beach at San Onofre was also grown significantly through construction of the nuclear power station at San Onofre. So you see the history of beaches getting bigger in Southern California from these nourishment projects. And now if we think about this trend at South Doheny, well, gosh, why are we losing South Doheny? What's going on down there? And I think if you go back and look at the last two storm events, 2010 and 2006, you kind of draw those here. Those storms, I think, are really important for delivering sediment to that part of the coastline. And when we have drought or we have development in the watershed, which changes the delivery of sediment, then we're going to see problems at the coastline. So I would say, drought is contributing to the challenges we face at South Orange County. So I'd like to share some quotes from a paper by Ron Flick, who many of you may know, is well known in Southern California as someone who's been studying beaches and coastal erosion. And he writes in a paper that was published in 1993 that it's precisely the act of humans that have made previously narrow beaches wide in Southern California. He points out that the popular opinion, often reflected in the media, is that coastal development has somehow led to the erosion of beaches that were naturally wide and sandy. But in contrast, the truth in many places seems to be the exact reverse. Coastal development and other human inventions have widened naturally marginal beaches. And this is especially true at Santa Monica Beach and Coronado City Beach. Santa Monica Beach is not a naturally wide beach, but through Marina del Rey construction and so forth, it grew tremendously and added sand to that system. He also goes on to point out that sort of around 1960s, then environmental objections to massive harbor dredging projects and wetland losses began to be taken seriously. So it was at that time that these types of projects changed. So then the third point I wanted to make today was, how can the impacts of sea level rise to Newport Beach be managed with sediment? And I'm not pointing out that this is the only solution, right? I just want to inform you about the role that sediment can play in addressing some aspects of the challenges of sea level rise. So first, let's ask the question, what is sea level rise? Okay, what I'm showing here are monthly average tide measurements in Los Angeles from 1925 up to around 2020, 100 years of tide data. What we can see there is that the sea level is variable, okay? Sea level goes through periods where it drifts upwards, it drifts downwards, but there is a long-term trend in the sea shifting upwards. That's what we mean by sea level rise, this long-term trend in the average sea level. Now, within that long-term trend, you can have periods where the water levels go up and down quite a lot. So here, back in, I think it was what year is that? It's like 2016, around there. We had an El Nino, which caused, and we had this thing called the blob out in the ocean, and it caused our water levels to rise up like considerably higher than average, higher than the tides were predicting. So here we saw a 15-centimeter rise for a period of a year or so, and then it went down again, okay? That amount of rise differs around the world. Some places, here the average rate over 100 years is around 1 millimeter per year at Los Angeles. If you were to fit a trend line through more recent data, you might say you would come up with a faster rate, like 3 or 4 centimeters per year. So depending on what duration of time you get to fit your trend line, you get a different slope for how fast sea level is rising. The other point here is I chose Boston as another example. Boston's had a rate of around 3 millimeters per year over that same window of time. Still has water levels going up and down, up and down, up and down, but the rate is higher. So different parts of the world are seeing different rates of sea level rise. And the concern now is that with global warming, we're going to not only expand the volume of water, because there's a thermal expansion component, but we're also going to melt the ice caps. And the ice caps are going to add tremendous amounts of water to the ocean. And so the expectation is that we're going to go from this linear trend that we've seen over the past half century or so into something which curves upwards. And the concave upwards movement is a result of adding more and more water from Greenland and from Antarctica. And this is where we're relying on climate models, and they're telling us how fast is this melting, what are the impacts, how much is the sea level going to rise. And those models have uncertainty, and they're trying to give us the best idea of what the current range of rates are. And that's fraught with some uncertainty, right? So it's hard to say. It depends on how much greenhouse gases we emit and how much the atmosphere warms. And then it depends on how fast the ice melts. These are uncertainties that scientists are trying to hammer that down. And there's some things scientists can't solve how much greenhouse gases people are going to emit. So they can't nail down their prediction very well from that perspective. Eric Rignot, one of my colleagues at UC Irvine, is one of the best people in the world looking at the ice loss. And what he's saying is that these things are melting quickly, quicker than what the IPCC is sort of acknowledging at this time. So that's what I know about sea level rise. And what I also know is that when we come to the community level, it's really frustrating to have this big distribution of possible sea level rise rates. When you're planning infrastructure, designing properties, there's a big window. Is it 5 feet? Is it 2 feet? And policymakers across the state and around the world are trying to figure out how do we deal with this. And it's not an easy issue. But just that's uncertainty in what's known about how much sea levels will rise. So coming back to sediment-based responses to sea level rise, how can we use sediment then to try to deal with these growing rates of sea level rise? And what I like to call accelerating sea level rise. So what I mean by accelerating is that instead of going at a constant rate, it starts inching up, going from 1 millimeter a year to 2 millimeter to 3 to 4, and that the rate of sea level rise is increasing. And so you want to be thinking about what can we do that's going to work in a world where the rate of sea level rise is inching upwards. So some ideas. Galveston, Texas, after a hurricane in 1900, they raised the city around 10 feet, a grade raising project. City Sacramento was flooded after the Great Flood of 1862, and they raised the city 9 feet. There's a history of big disasters, flooding cities, and the cities turning around and raising up to higher elevations. Typically, these things happen after disasters. The kind of flooding that we have in Southern California is less disaster-like. We're not going to have a storm surge of a hurricane come in that's going to sort of swamp communities with 10 feet of water, right? We're talking about El Nino storms that can erode the coastline and overtop the beaches and cause street flooding and damage some of those properties right along the coastline. We have a different type of disaster. But the thing is, we want to be thinking, do we want to wait till after a disaster to raise elevations, or maybe we could, if we start now and move slowly forward, can we slowly over time pick areas to raise up over time and sort of move elevations to higher ground? It's been done in the past. Clearly, another sediment-based response is beach nourishment, and I'll add dune restoration. I'll come back to dune restoration, which I think is really exciting. And the third thing I'll point out is something that's sort of called thin film augmentation. And this is a method of using fine sediment in wetlands like Upper Newport Bay, and then using it to help the wetland get higher. Because the wetland is, people that study wetlands are saying these wetlands along California are going to be submerged by higher and higher water. We're going to lose the intertidal habitat. We're not sure that's uniformly true. We think some systems are better adept at sort of accommodating the projected rates of sea level rise. But there is this intervention that's available, which is increasingly looking promising, which is to take bay sediments and then spread them out in a thin layer over the vegetation, and let the vegetation grow through it, and that helps the vegetation grow to higher ground. So thinking about a more comprehensive strategy with sediment, I think it's helpful just to acknowledge a couple of things. And I hope that my presentation thus far has kind of made the case. One, let's acknowledge that human influences have strongly affected our coastal beaches and shorelines over the past century and will continue. And we also acknowledge that some coastal cities have already adapted to very high rates of sea level rise by dealing with subsidence. How much subsidence has there been in Long Beach? Anybody know?
28 feet.
Yeah. So there are parts of Long Beach that have dealt with tens of feet of subsidence, right? So they've already dealt with sea level rise of 20 feet. I mean, some of those are ports, and they have enormous economic revenue to justify, taking down everything, moving all the, oh geez, I'm getting too animated. Step back. But they have the resources to take everything out, build it up to higher ground, put their infrastructure back in, and keep going. Okay. But the point is that's an end member that's, I think, a reasonable point of comparison. So secondly, I like to acknowledge that in responding to future sea level rise, we must do a better job of balancing social, environmental, and economic needs. Right. So we built out all of our stormwater across Southern California, and we destroyed riparian ecosystems. We're now learning that those riparian ecosystems actually would have helped improve our water quality. They would have helped bring urban amenities to communities. They're now living next to hardened concrete channels. They could have helped support ecosystems. They could have helped with sediment delivery to the coast. And just think about this thought. At a time when we're seeing increasing fire and debris flows and sediment coming out of the mountains, we could be seeing more sediment delivery to the coast because we're generating way more sediment in the mountains. But we're going to trap that sediment in reservoirs, and we're going to have a disposal to kind of figure out a way to get it to a landfill. And it seems like our system wants to help us deal with sea level rise, but it can't because we're trapping it all in the mountains. So not all of it, but you get the idea that the point is that so our stormwater infrastructure was not good for the environment overall. Definitely worked well from a flood management perspective to a degree. And then the other thing is that as we built out all of our coastal harbors, and we destroyed a lot of coastal wetlands, which we know are really important for juvenile fish and habitats and ecosystems. We could have struck a better balance between environment, and we need to do that in the future. We hear a lot about manage retreat, and that is an option. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to invest and try to hold the line. And it's an option, but I don't think it's the only option. Right? I think what's key is that you have some long-term plan for increasing rates of sea level rise that balances the needs of communities and ecosystems and is affordable. Okay, so among the research community and the management community, I work with NOAA. We have a project that kind of fits in this realm, and there's increasing interest in what's called living shorelines. Okay, what is a living shoreline? A living shoreline is something that combines green and gray infrastructure. The gray refers to the hard elements, the concrete part, sometimes rocks, riprap. What that brings is like basically protection against damage during extreme events. But then the green element refers to a reliance on natural processes to deliver environmental benefits and also ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are things that ecosystems do that benefit us. So I'd like to share a couple of examples of, and I guess I'll add that we don't really know what a living shoreline means yet for Southern California, okay? The idea of living shoreline has kind of emerged from East Coast, Gulf Coast, where you have a different set of stresses, different geographical context. And I think it behooves us to think about what a living shoreline really means in a place like Southern California, where like mangroves off the coast of Southern California do not make sense, right? It doesn't make sense, but sometimes you hear say, oh, you should grow wetlands off the coastline. We can't do that here. We have a very energetic coastline. It doesn't make sense to do that here. What we have are beaches. And we have coastal wetlands. And so when you think about those systems, the local context, and we should be thinking about what a living shoreline really means for Southern California. This is an example I like to point to. There was a Hurricane Sandy, when it struck New Jersey, there was a spit here between Bay Head and Mantalocking. And when the storm came in and overtopped this whole spit/barrier island, Bay Head region was spared the worst of the damage. There was much worse damage further south. And after the storm came, what they found was that there was an old relic seawall buried under the beach. And it was built in the 1800s, some cobble that was kind of cemented together, and it had been covered with sand. But when the storm came, it eroded away the beach, the sand was all gone, but the cobble berm provided some energy dissipation for those waves. And by dissipating those really damaging energetic waves, the community behind it was spared the same level of damage that was experienced further south. So I think that's a nice example of a system that combines a green element, which in this case is sand. It's not living, but it's natural, okay? And a hardened element like the cemented riprap. Another example I like to point to is from the Dutch coast. This is Katwijk Beach in the Netherlands. And what we see here is a coastline that maybe looks a little bit like Southern California. You've got a highly densely developed urban area, okay? And then you've got a beach, which is valued for recreation and activities and tourism and everything else. In this case, they're having to deal with these massive storms off the North Sea that can bring a lot of wave energy, big storm surges. And so the Dutch government, and the Dutch designs for like really high return period, like 10,000-year events. They design big stuff. And they decided they were going to build up a really big beach to guard against these coastal storms. But they wanted to find a better way to strike a balance between environmental benefits, benefits to the business community, the local communities, protect cultural assets, and so on. And so what they did was they put in a massive amount of sand, built up the beach with sand here, so they pushed out the shoreline. Then they came in behind that and built this big dune system. And the natural dune system provided habitat that they had long ago lost through development. So you're providing a benefit to the environment with dune habitat. You ended up providing a benefit to the public with access, which I'll show you shortly. And if we can look at these photographs here, they have a parking lot underneath the dune. And they have all this dune habitat, vegetation, parking can go underneath, interesting architecture. If you look at a cross-section of this system, you've got the business community behind the beach. You've got a buried parking structure. So now you have access, businesses win, you get people coming to the beach, a place to park. They put a very strong concrete wall into the side of the parking structure, which acts as a barrier to massive storms, okay? So the idea is that most of the time, this stuff will never touch water, okay? Most of the time, water is going to come in contact with sand, with the dune, interact with the environment. But in the event of an extreme event, which is really, really energetic and damaging, that sand gets washed away, and there's still some concrete there to provide a more reliable protection against flooding and erosion. On top of that, they created sort of seasonal spaces on the beach for restaurants and shops. So their winter is very cold. They don't have many beaches or many people on the sand, but they have space where some of these businesses, then the ocean had gotten so far away, they kind of lost some access to the water, but there was spaces created closer to the water for businesses to have restaurants and cafes and things like that. So I think this is just a good example of how we can be thinking a little more creatively about balancing the needs of the environment, balancing the needs of cities and communities, balancing the concerns about storm damage. And so now maybe to kind of wrap up, we can think about sort of the sediment dynamics around Newport Beach and how they kind of constrain us. Actually, it's pretty complicated to think about sediment around Newport Beach. So I'll try to walk you through what I see as the key processes, the key drivers of moving sediment. So first, we've got waves moving sediment around. Okay, so waves are primarily moving sediment down coast in the winter. You might see some up coast movement in the summer, depending on the wave direction. So we've got waves moving sediment up and down the coast here, and you've also got the end of the San Pedro Cell moving sediment offshore into Newport Canyon. So overall, you've got a flow of sediment this way into Newport Canyon. So we've got a supply from the Santa Ana River, which that's coming in with the big storms. Okay, so occasionally we get a big storm. We also have an excess of sediment coming in San Diego Creek. Interestingly, we want sediment out of the Santa Ana River to feed our cells. This is an excess of sediment which creates management problems for the bay. So what's confusing about sediment management is we think, oh, we need more sediment. Oh, wait a minute, we have too much sediment, right? So we've got these problems with some places we have too much, other places we want more. In terms of managing the sediment, harbor jetties have been set up at the outlet of the harbor, which have stabilized these beaches and have been pretty successful, very successful projects. We have a groin system in West Newport, which helps to stabilize that section of the shoreline. Big sedimentation basins in Upper Newport Bay, which are dredged every decade or so, so that the sediment doesn't come down and fill up the harbor. It creates management problems, and also to protect the habitat and the water quality of the bay. And then a TMDL was put in the 80s and 90s to try to reduce the flow of sediment into Newport Bay. And that's been very successful, actually. They've cut down sediment supplies in Newport Bay by a factor of 2. Beach nourishment projects are moving sediment to the coastline here. And we've got these bay dredging projects which are taking sediment far offshore. We've also got seasonal berms, which are put up to guard against coastal flooding. Some of the guys here that build those berms, we chatted earlier today. So you can see we've got a lot of things going on to manage sediment. We've got waves moving sediment around, currents moving sediment around, river bringing sediment. We're dredging. We've got groins and jetties. So now if we think about within that context, what are the opportunities for sea level rise adaptation with sediment? I would say one is any policies that increase sediment supplies from the rivers. I think that would be good for the coastline. That would be an opportunity, so through policy intervention. Regional beach nourishment programs are going to be good for the region to bring more sediment down the coast. Thin film augmentation has potential for Upper Bay. I think the jury's still out and we're trying to research this, whether San Diego Creek flows might naturally help the marsh grow up in Upper Newport Bay. It's not clear we need to do artificial nourishment. There's some thinking, one of our thinking is, well, maybe we should let those basins fill up a little bit and encourage storms to flow over the Upper Newport Bay and deposit fine sediment in Upper Newport Bay to help the marsh grow higher, to take advantage of that natural supply. We have some models set up, and Matt Brand, one of my graduate students, is doing that modeling if you want to chat with him about that. Another thing I think should be thought about is grade raising, getting everything up to higher ground. And I think it makes sense if you realize that we have decades of planning ahead of us. Opportunities to do one little piece at a time. All these things, none of these things are easy. Some will face bigger challenges than others, but it's something to discuss and think about. Another, I think, really interesting thought is the possibility of some dune restoration along the open coast. Dune restoration is happening at Tijuana. It's happening up in, I think it's Bolsa Chica, there's some dune restoration going on. There's several places along the coast where there's been dune restoration. What's cool about dune restoration is that with vegetation on the sand, the beaches grow upwards pretty fast. The beaches can grow vertically upwards faster than sea level rise, okay? So we have to get higher, and we need more sand, and it's one of the natural processes we can lean on to try to provide environmental benefits and to guard against coastal storms and erosion. I think something else to be thinking about is more what we consider beneficial reuse of harbor sediments along the shoreline. This is really tricky. You've got a mixture of coarse sediment, fine sediment. You've got some sediments that are contaminated. So navigating that path is really bureaucratic, it's tough, but increasingly we're seeing across the state of California, people are saying, look, sea levels are rising. We've got all this sediment accumulating in harbors that we're taking far offshore at great expense to dispose. Isn't there some way we could be using that sediment here right on our own beaches? And the research so far suggests two things. One, there's toxics issues that you cannot get around. Okay, we're not going to be putting toxic materials in places that are going to threaten people's public health. But they're also showing that if you put a mixture of coarse and fine sediment in the coastal waters where waves can mix it, the fines tend to mix away pretty quickly and leave behind the coarse material. So we can use wave energy to naturally thin out those fines and let the fines go offshore. So I think it has potential, and it's one of those things that really needs to work its way through the sort of the management world. And we're in our NOAA project, we're talking to managers across the state of California to try to think, where's the space, where are the opportunities where we can streamline management, streamline permitting, to try to make these types of projects more cost-effective, more timely. They take a long time to plan. The last point I want to make is that in our research here in Newport Beach, and Newport Beach has been an incredible partner for us over the years, one of the things we found is, and we just published a paper about this, which I've cited here, is that these environmental challenges are complex and difficult to sort of have conversations about. People have different perceptions of what the problem is, and we can get in situations where one person's talking about one issue and someone else is talking about another issue, and those conversations don't go anywhere. But what we found is that when we create visualizations of these challenges, visualizing where water could go, where sediment could be, what it might look like, this creates really much more productive conversations about these challenges that brings more people into the conversation, so that those people, for example, without resources, without the ability to hire experts and study it in detail, can be more involved in providing and have a better opportunity to provide their input into a process. So this is what we call collaborative modeling, where researchers try to pull in diverse views, learn from the community, and bring the science with the knowledge of the community together in a way that's useful for supporting planning, decision-making, deliberation, and so on. So that's sort of a thrust of our work at the Blum Center. So on that note, thank you very much.
Well, that was a tremendously energetic and eye-opening bit of information. It certainly opened my eyes to some opportunities that we have, some things that we're doing right, and some things that we're probably not doing right. So I certainly thank you for coming today, and all those citizens of Newport Beach that will see this program over the next month or so. I think that will start some of those thoughts, and maybe we can continue this someday. Instead of going home with boots, we can go home barefoot to walk in the sand, I guess. So, it is now my unbelievably distinct pleasure to bring back to the dais the man who was a legend in his own mind. Dr. Rosansky.
Doctor, yes. My mom wishes I was a doctor. So, yeah, great program. Thank you, Matt, for all that information. Obviously, we have decades of planning to do here in Newport Beach. We've already started with some of the more minor things, raising the seawalls on Balboa Island. I know the city's going to be discussing flooding on the peninsula. We might be seeing homes built on stilts here in the near future, which will be something a little bit different, but it's a conversation that will be ongoing, and I know our city council members were here today, and they'll be addressing those issues in the years to come. In the more recent future is some of our events that we have coming up, so I'll just quickly run through them. Next Tuesday, our group, Inspire Women in Business, is going to have their next meeting. It's going to be at Red O. It's from 11:30 to 1. The topic is financial freedom for women, be engaged to be empowered. It's a panel discussion, and they'll be talking about being engaged and being empowered. So come, if you're interested in that, please sign up. We have, for our young professionals, our Navigate group is meeting next Wednesday at the Lot Theater. It's going to be trivia night there, so please, we target the under 40 crowd for that. 25 to 40 is our sweet spot. Everybody is welcome, though, so if you're feeling under 40, you're welcome, too. That's going to be at 6 p.m. Wednesday at the Lot Theater in Fashion Island. They have a great restaurant attached to it, and we're going to have our trivia night there. Our next business education lunch is just going to be, I think, a straight networking one, right, Pam? Networking, straight networking, no speaker. It's going to be at the Capitol Grill over at South Coast Plaza. Great place to have lunch and to network, so please join us for that. That's February 19th, Wednesday from 11:30 to 1:30. Our next mixer is going to be at the newer, not new yet still, but newer Tavern House. Used to be 333 on Coast Highway. It's going to be at Tavern House Thursday, February 27th from 5:30 to 7:30. If you're a member, you get in free. If you're not a member, why not? Well, you should be. But we're happy to put you on the guest list if you want to take a little test drive on one of our mixers. Our next Wake Up Newport, I think, is March 6th. And we will be hearing from our mayor, Will O'Neill. Tonight is, I think I mentioned earlier, is the mayor's dinner over at the Marriott Hotel. It's basically, almost $100 a ticket to hear him give the State of the Union speech. You can come here next month for free, get free food, and hear him give the same speech, hopefully. So please come back next month. That's right. And last but not least, we just went live with our Police Appreciation Breakfast. We do this every year. This is our 49th annual Police Appreciation Breakfast. It'll be at the Hyatt Regency John Wayne Airport. It's $55 to attend, $650 if you want a table sponsorship, and we'll put 4 police officers or family members at your table. That's going to be March 20th, Friday. You can go for all these events to www.newportbeach.com. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next month when we hear from the mayor.